Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Cain. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollycain.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hi, friend, and welcome to episode 98 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and today I am here with my co-host, Holly Cain.
Hi, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Today we're kicking off a new series on the podcast about mental health. And today's episode is going to be a little bit different than our usual. I am going to be interviewing Holly about her experience with anxiety. So you're going to hear her own experience and her struggle with this, as well as how it's impacted her leadership journey. But before we get into that conversation, we want to mention something special that we have coming up in just a few weeks.
Yes, we are getting ready to celebrate our 100th episode. Can you believe it?
Oh my goodness. It's crazy. I can't really believe it.
And we want to include you in that episode. So we'd love to hear you send in an audio clip of how the show has impacted you or benefited your leadership. You could share about a specific episode or a guest that really encouraged you.
Yeah, we are so excited to hear your voices on this episode. We don't want it to just be Holly and I, so we'd love to hear from you if this podcast has impacted you in any way. So when you send in that audio clip, you'll want to make sure to tell us your name, and also if you have your own website or podcast, or maybe even just what your leadership role is, you're welcome to mention any of those things. And this is coming up very soon. So Friday, May 8th is the absolute deadline for getting your audio clips to us. So if you're listening to this before May 8th, 2020, then go ahead and go over to my website, click the send voicemail button. That's a really easy way to do it. You can literally click the button, record yourself, and then it will send it right to me. Or you can check the show notes for other ways to get your audio clip in to us. So let's go ahead and get ready to dive into our topic today. And before I start really chatting with you, Holly, and asking you some questions, let's just talk for a minute about why we wanted to focus on this topic of mental health for this month.
Yeah, so May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And while we've never shied away from talking about this issue on our podcast, we want to be intentional about bringing some episodes that address this topic specifically. So that's why this month we are going to have at least 3 episodes dedicated to the topic of mental health. And I just wanted to mention that today during our conversations, I'm going to be talking about my experience. And I am in no way an expert on mental health. If you've listened to the podcast, you know that. So if you might struggle with any mental health issue or are diagnosed with something specific, you should create a treatment plan with your doctor or mental health professional, and don't necessarily take what I say as gold. It's just my experience. So
Right. And we try to always mention that we don't feel like we're experts on a whole lot of things, but we try, and that's why we try to bring in guests that are whenever we can. And that's really why we decided this first episode where we're introducing the topic. We didn't want to do just a typical you and I discussing it and giving our insights on it, because really we want to leave that to the experts. But we do think that it would be valuable for you to hear one of our own experiences and journey with this particular issue. So I am so grateful that you're willing to share this, Holly, because I know it's not always easy to talk about these kind of things for one thing, it's not even easy to talk about it like with your friends and in small groups and things like that. But especially when you know it's going to be out on a podcast publicly for anyone to listen to. So I want to thank you for being willing to do that. And in this conversation, we're going to focus on your experience with anxiety. So are you ready?
Yeah, I am. I feel like I should be laying on a couch somewhere. But
oh, well. But I am not a therapist,
Oh,
Holly,
that's right.
so
That's right. Okay.
I'm just going to ask you questions.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So let's go back in time. We often go back in time with our guests about their earlier experiences. So can you just share if you remember when you were a child? Do you remember experiencing anxiety as a child?
So as an adult, I really have looked back and sort of figured this out. We definitely didn't call it anxiety when I was a kid. Right. So I was highly emotional, even hysterical at times, lots of irrational fears. Change was extremely hard for me to handle. And when I was in those sort of upset states, I got even more upset when people tried to help me. And I would resist anyone who tried to give me like coping techniques. And, I had recurring nightmares and stuff like that. And as I kind of talk about this, it sounds like, I had this really traumatic, awful childhood, but I really didn't. I had a really great childhood. My parents were very, very loving, but, I just struggled with some things and didn't know how to handle it emotionally, didn't know how to cope. And, my parents were not equipped to deal with this, right? Like they had no idea. And my sister and I are wildly different. So, they didn't even have any sort of experience from parenting her ahead of me. They just had to deal with this, person who was emotional about literally everything. So it was never something that I could have even pinpointed. Like in my 20s, if you had even asked me, were you an anxious child or had anxiety as a child, I probably would have said no. But as an adult dealing with anxiety and looking back, I can see that there were some roots of some of this that were there as a child. So
yeah. And I know that it's so funny when we look back as adults, we can have that hindsight is 2020 kind of factor. And like you said, I don't think that at the time that you and I were growing up, that this was really something that was talked about. Mental health was definitely not talked about to the level that it is now. And even though now we need more awareness and more open conversations about it, it definitely was not as much back then.
Right.
And I will also say that having you as a friend has been very helpful for me in my parenting journey, because I've shared before that my daughter has struggled with this, and it's been helpful to talk to you about your experience as a child so that I can get some perspective on how to move forward. So
I wish I could say this is something that someone did that really helped me, but I guess just looking back on it and from a child's perspective, how it was kind of going on in my mind, hopefully is helpful.
Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, it is. It is. It has been. So let's talk about when did you first realize that you might actually be dealing with something called anxiety? When did that first occur to you?
So it's so interesting. And if you have anxiety, you probably will totally relate to this. So Zach and I were dating at the time, and we traveled to Connecticut to go to a wedding of a friend of mine. She had been my roommate the year before in college when I was in New York State. And so we drove there. And as we were driving back, and I should say, like, traffic does not make me nervous. If you listen to any of our episodes where we talk about road rage.
There was one just recently. What was it? Episode 95, I think, was the one where we ranted for about 10 minutes about our driving.
Traffic doesn't bother me in any way. I might get a little worked up, but I'm not actually anxious about it. I'm more worried about other people following the rules of the road than anything else. And I just remember being in the car. I was perfectly calm. We may have just been chit-chatting about something. And all of a sudden, I felt like there was an elephant sitting on my chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My whole body just kind of like, I don't want to say like seized because it wasn't a seizure, but it just hit me like a ton of bricks out of nowhere. And I thought I was having a heart attack. I thought I was having an asthma attack. I thought I was having all of these things. And, it was almost like the world around me went like blurry. And I had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
And Zach had no idea what was going on. He was driving. And I wasn't in any type of stressful situation. But now as I look back, and I've dealt with this for a while, I can see that sometimes when I have an anxiety attack, it's after a stressful situation and I'm able to kind of release and relax. And then all of that pent up stress and frustration that I was dealing with, bottling, trying to hold in eventually comes out. And it hits me at a time when I'm the most relaxed and when I feel the most comfortable to actually let those things kind of out. And then my body just kind of takes over. Yeah. And so it was at that point that I was kind of like, okay, there's something bigger going on here. Like, this is not just stress. This is not just, normal, as you would call quote unquote anxiety, like regular things that people deal with. There's something more here. But I was in my 20s and I was, I was working, I was going to college, I was doing all of these things. And so I didn't have time to deal with it. And it was crippling for that one day and maybe the day after, but then I was fine. So I just kind of moved on after that. But it was really scary. And it just kind of got the wheels turning of me going, okay, there's something more happening here.
Yeah. Okay. So at that time, you didn't pursue any kind of getting any help for that?
No.
Because it was just a one-time incident, it sounds like, to that extent.
And, as we kind of do in our 20s, at least I did, I pushed all that stuff aside. And I was just like, I've got bigger things to deal with right now. I've got this guy that I need to convince to marry me. And I've got this degree that I need to try to finish. And I've got all these jobs. And, I felt like I was proving people wrong, that anyone who might have said anything negative about me in the past, like I had to prove that I was going to achieve and do all these things. And so I just didn't care, know?
Right.
So,
Yeah. And I just want to just pull out one of the points that you just made is that really in this conversation, we're talking more about a clinical level of anxiety versus just the regular, we hear a lot in the news, even right now, about anxiety, and you hear a lot about worry. And we're not talking about just kind of the everyday level of worry or anxiety that we all deal with, because everybody does deal with this to some degree. But there comes a point, like you said, where it's either incapacitating or affecting your life on a regular basis. And that's where we need to go back to talk to your doctor, talk to a mental health professional to get help if it's in that realm. But I just wanted to differentiate that this conversation is really not just about regular worry. So, yeah. All right. So let's go forward. What has this anxiety looked like for you over different seasons of your life?
Yeah. So to kind of go to the next step in the story, Zach and I obviously got married and
you convinced him.
I did. Although I don't know why I say that, because he was ready to marry me before we ever had our first date, but
he pursued you longer than
he did.
So
I think I just needed him to get me. I needed him to marry me at the exact time that I wanted him to marry me. It was more about timing.
Okay.
So anyway, we got married and pretty soon after decided that we wanted to start a family and just started going through infertility and trying to, start a family and get that part of our life going. And for whatever reason, it just wasn't happening. And if you've ever struggled with infertility in the same way I did, it felt really all consuming. Like there just wasn't a thought that wasn't related to infertility. So I remember one night waking up in the middle of the night thinking that I was having an anxiety attack, or an asthma attack, and going to the emergency room. But if you've ever had an asthma attack, they immediately get what's called an O2 sat on you to try and figure out how saturated you are with oxygen. Because if you are not saturated with oxygen, then it's an issue.
Yeah.
And I had a really high level, which means I was not dealing with an asthma attack. And I just remember being in the emergency room, and they had given me something for anxiety, and I was very resistant. No, I don't need that. I'm having an asthma attack. This is not what this is. It's not related to anything that what's going on with me. Like, no, no, no. And I just remember this nurse coming in and talking to me and saying, it's really okay that you're having this going, like that this is happening to you. You need to take this medication. It's going to help you relax. It's going to help you, feel better. And then after you feel better, we can talk about this a little bit more. So I remember taking it. I actually worked at the hospital, so I even knew this person, which was kind of embarrassing and frustrating all at the same time. But anyway, she kind of sat and talked to me, and she was like, well, do you have any stress going on in your life? And of course, infertility came up, and I was like, okay, that was kind of the point when all the pieces sort of clicked together. And I was like, I know that this has been going on longer in my life, but this is the issue that's really sort of overwhelming me and overtaking me. And I couldn't get a handle on it. It wasn't like I could sort of logic my way out of it. There was nothing really that was calming me down. I was just on 10 all the time and so stressed out and worried about the whole situation. So that's when things really kind of escalated. And again, I just kind of ignored it and tried to get along the best I could. We eventually were able to become pregnant after some infertility treatment. And I was so sick that I don't even know if I had a conscious thought the entire pregnancy because I was just so sick the whole time. But I remember, to kind of fast forward a little bit more, after Eli was born, I was overcome with fear that he was going to die, or fear that Zach was going to die. These were not just fleeting thoughts. These were vivid. When you kind of have like a daydream and it's really vivid, that's what it was like. And it would grip me, and I would feel like I was immediately in that situation. We had someone that we had known who had a baby. We had known them through their family member. They had a baby around the same time as us. And unfortunately, that baby died of SIDS and was weeks in age difference from Eli. And I just remember sort of walking through that with them to some extent. I mean, we were kind of distant, but knowing the family and kind of knowing what they were going through. But that just immediately brought it to the forefront of my mind and made it that much more real.
Yeah.
And, it was one of those things where you're not getting sleep anyway because you are taking care of an infant. And I had some other complicating issues. I had to have surgery 3 weeks after I had him. And so it was a pretty rough time. And I just remember feeling like I was overtaken by it, and that I would just sit and hold Eli and just cry because I knew he was going to be taken away from me. And like, it's so irrational.
Yeah.
So irrational. But there, like I said, when you're in those situations and you're dealing with it, there's no amount of logic that's really going to get you out of those situations.
Yeah.
And so fast forward even more. I know this is kind of long, but it really kind of took hold of who I was and really kind of sunk down deep into my mind, to the point where when Eli was probably 5 or 6 maybe, and we were living in Bangor where we lived before we moved to Florida, in Maine. And I just remember having this kind of realization that I have no positive thoughts, like, ever. There's not any positive thought that goes through my head. And every single thought leads to a train that heads on a spiral down to really dark thoughts. And it was kind of when I had that thought, and when I had been hearing our women's pastor, Sandy, talk about just normal stuff that she would talk about. So like her relationship with God, and how she so truly understands that he loves her, and her just assuredness in that relationship. And I kind of just thought, something's not right here. Like, I'm not thinking anything positive about myself. I'm not thinking anything positive about my life. I'm not thinking anything positive, even about stupid things like, a bottle of water. Like, this has no bearing on my life or whatever. And I could easily take that and go along that sort of mental train to somewhere really dark and scary and live there for a while. And so, yeah, I think that that's kind of how it has progressed for me, and sort of what it has looked like throughout different times in my life.
Okay. So I kind of have two questions in mind right now, but the first one is, during this whole time that you've experienced this, you've been a Christian, right?
Yeah.
It's been,
yeah.
So this hasn't been like, this wasn't something that happened before you came to faith.
No.
Were there things that you tried to do in terms of faith, in terms of your faith, to deal with this? I'm just curious if there were things that you attempted to get help that way.
Yeah. So I think through a lot of the years, I was too afraid to talk about it. So to actually go to someone and say, I think I have anxiety, can you help me, was not anything I was able to do for a long, long time.
Yeah.
But I would pray and I would beg God to take it away from me. I would really feel ashamed that I was not doing this Christian thing right. Like, obviously, either I'm not saved or I don't really know God, because if I did, he would take this away and I wouldn't be feeling like this. So either I'm a really bad Christian or I'm not at all, or, all of these different things. And so, yes, God would definitely give me comfort during times. And there were times when I would pray when, I was having really bad either anxiety attacks or just having really hard days, where he would sort of pull me up out of that. I'm not saying that he didn't.
Yeah.
But when I was in that place, I couldn't see that as something positive. And it didn't feel like something I could count on every time. And I never was mad at God that he didn't do that. I took it as a reflection on myself. So I'm not a good enough Christian. I'm not doing this right if I'm dealing with this. So,
Okay. Yeah. I'm guessing there's people that can relate to that experience. So when did you finally get to the point where you realized you needed to do something? Was it closer to this point where you were like feeling that and not having any positive thoughts at all? Is that the point where you said, all right, I need to do something?
Yeah. So thankfully we moved to Bangor from where we were more north in Maine, because church was not a solace for me until that point. Church was not anywhere that I felt safe. In fact, church was definitely a place to hide and cover all of that stuff up.
Okay.
That was the place I needed to do it the most. So when I came to Open Door and kind of saw how people were actually real, and even, our pastor talking very openly about some of his struggles in life, that really made a huge impression on me, because I had grown up seeing pastors really try to save face, not talk about any of the really ugly stuff that people deal with. They would talk about their struggles in a really pretty way.
Yeah.
And so I never saw that modeled. I never saw a leader actually come forth and say that they had any of these issues, how they dealt with it, how their spiritual walk was sort of formed or affected by it in any way. And so I had no modeling for that. And it was through our women's pastor, who we've talked about tons of times, and she's been on the podcast, Sandy, when I really kind of heard her be really real about some of the things that she struggled with, and just hearing her, as I kind of talked about, hearing her talk about her relationship with God, I was like, okay, I need to talk to her. And so she does counseling. Well, I don't think she would call it that.
Yeah.
I think
soul
she calls
care.
it spiritual direction.
Yes.
So I said to her, can I meet with you? And I'll never forget, like, I had a conversation with Zach. I said, I think I need to talk to her. Like, this is getting out of hand. Like, I can't walk around feeling like this. I either felt overflowing with bad emotions or I felt totally empty. Like, I just couldn't do that anymore. And he was like, yeah, do whatever you need to do. And so I went and I talked to Sandy, and, we just kind of, she was really great to talk to because, and those who don't know her don't kind of maybe understand, but she's so open and so kind and so easy to just pour your whole soul out to, that it didn't take me very long to do that. And, it just kind of came to that pinnacle where I said, I don't have any positive thoughts. Like, there are no positive thoughts. And she was kind of, I'll never forget, because she didn't brush it aside, and she didn't poo-poo it, and she didn't freak out either. She just sat there and sat with me in kind of the gravity of the situation and allowed us both to kind of feel that, and then gently prodded me towards God and towards the things that he does say about me. And I will never forget, like, we talked and she played this song for me that I needed to hear. And of course, I lost it and cried through the whole thing, which was Andrew Peterson. I don't know if you know him. He sings a song called Be Kind to Yourself. And that was exactly what I needed to hear at the time. And then at the end of our session together, we prayed. And she prayed for me. And I can truly say that God healed me from a very big portion of that anxiety. And at the time, I would have said that he completely healed me from anxiety. The darkness that I felt was kind of coming over me lifted, and my mind could think clearly. And he just took a lot of that away. And so I literally said to Sandy, like, you're the best ever. I only needed one session, and God cured me.
Wow. The end. Happily ever after,
The
right?
end, right? But sort of as life has gone on, I've realized that there was healing during that time. He did not completely take it away, but I am able to have positive thoughts now, and I am able to, he lifted that despair out of my heart and out of my mind. And while I still might have anxiety, I do believe that there was a measure of healing at that point. I do also believe that if he wanted to completely heal me, he could, but that's just not his story for my life right now. And I'm okay with that, because I completely trust him. And I understand that while I'm going through this, whether he chooses to heal me or not, he's always been faithful to me. So,
yeah. And I think that's such an important point that you make here, because, we hear the different perspectives on healing.
Yeah.
In the Christian body, there are different perspectives on this topic. But especially when it comes to mental health issues, I feel like there is an assumption that if you are a Christian and that if you pray and that you have faith, that God will take away the anxiety or the depression or XYZ situation.
Right.
And just like cancer and diabetes and other health issues that we might experience, sometimes God does completely heal somebody, right? And they never deal with it again. And then other times God uses doctors and experts to help them. And then sometimes they live with it for a long time and even sometimes pass away. So there's, I think that just as us, as Christian women in leadership, to recognize as we're supporting people that might be experiencing this, to really have that sensitivity. And what I loved that you said that Sandy did for you is you said she didn't brush over it.
Yeah.
And she sat with you in that for a little while, and I think that is so key for us to be willing to do with people who are struggling in any level of pain. So,
yeah, I think it was important because anyone that I had talked to about it didn't really know how to handle it. And I'm okay with that. Like, I don't expect just because that I'm married to Zach and we have a great relationship that he knows how to handle someone with anxiety. Like,
Yeah.
he didn't go to school for that. He doesn't know.
Mhm.
And so I try not to expect that of him. And so when she sat and really saw me in that and really felt the gravity of what was going on with me,
Mhm.
it was so refreshing because I knew how painful it was and how all consuming it was. But whenever I would talk to anyone about that, they would just either try to make me feel better or they would not really know how to handle it. And
Yeah.
so just really understanding, and more than anything, it was so validating.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
so validating that she understood how much of a struggle it was.
Yeah.
So,
Right. And she didn't just sit there and start to quote scripture to you
no.
or just immediately go to, well, here's what God would want you to do, or,
Right.
yeah. So that's
Yeah.
just so valuable for us to remember as we're talking to people. So you mentioned that, you met with Sandy, but then that you've recognized that there have been other times where it hasn't necessarily gone away forever. And so
Right.
I'm curious, what else have you done to help, battle, fight, deal with
Yeah.
the anxiety over the years?
So and you know, and this has happened in different times of my life, but there have been times when, the thoughts and feelings that I have and sort of irrational fears are kind of overwhelming. And I have used quite a different variety of things over time. And probably if I was more consistent with them, it would be good. But I'm not a consistent person. My word for the year is commit. I'm trying to be more consistent. But
Yes.
over the years, I have used medication. That was a really hard thing for me to kind of actually accept and process through,
Mm,
that it was okay to take something, that it was okay to need to take something, and that there were just going to be times when it was a part of my life. And
yeah.
that was hard to process for a lot of different reasons. But, after feeling really sort of dark and heavy and having kind of this shadow over my life and having medication that makes you feel like you can get up and tackle the day in a really good way, it's totally worth it.
Yeah.
And of course, as we mentioned before, like, this is something you want to talk to your doctor with and sort of figure out. But for me, it was a positive experience.
Yeah.
And then I think a lot of my other sort of coping mechanisms have come with a lot of self reflection and processing. So, learning kind of what my baseline is, we've talked about that before in the podcast, sort of knowing when things are out of control or when things are sort of status quo has really helped me kind of figure out when I actually need to employ some of these tactics.
Yeah.
Also, learning triggers, sort of managing risk and trying to figure out, when I'm walking into a situation that will kind of make things worse, sort of knowing those things. And then when I sort of feel really, when I'm having those sort of out of control kind of feelings or it's starting, I have tried before grounding. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And that kind of, for me, more than anything, is kind of redirection. And it just kind of, not that it gets my mind off of it, but it gives me something to focus on
Yeah.
rather than the thing that's really overtaking me at the time.
And it seems like that is something that helps you to be in the moment of
Hmm.
right now. And
Yeah.
so many times anxiety is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen it as you're thinking about all the potential possibilities of the future and all the things that could happen 10 years from now. And that tool kind of helps you focus on right now, where I'm
Hmm.
at, what's happening right now. So
Yeah, because when you're kind of on that sort of mental train, that spiral, you're not in the moment. You are wherever that train is taking you, and you're fully realizing and fully living those
yeah.
things. Like, whenever I would have thought that, like when Eli was a baby, like that Zach was going to die or Eli was going to die. It wasn't like I was just sitting in the moment thinking about that. My mind was fully there and I was fully experiencing as if I was living it at that point. And it's so hard to pull yourself back to reality that sort of grounding can really help. And then in more recent years, the things that I've really worked on, I mean, obviously praying was a part of it the whole time, but being really more intentional about my prayers, spiritual warfare prayers definitely are part of it, because while mental illness is definitely something that is biological, I do believe that the enemy uses that against us and can heighten or trigger or cause things to come in that will make it worse. And so I do feel like some of that spiritual warfare, those prayers are definitely part of that. It's a tool in your tool chest, I guess, if you will. And then the other things, the things that you've heard a lot, taking every thought captive, setting your mind on Christ, renewing my mind in scripture, memorizing sort of counteractive scripture, scripture that like flies right in the face of what I'm actually thinking. And then just really checking in with myself and sort of doing kind of a self-assessment, like, where are you at? Is it time to, ask for help, or is it time to do some of these different things? And when you're in the throes of anxiety, sometimes that's the hardest thing you can do, is just step back and be objective and figure out where you are and what you need. But it's kind of a muscle that you have to exercise and do over and over again. And sometimes even for me, if I can just say to Zach, I'm having a hard time, then he's able to sort of process that with me. That's a really good way to start. So,
Okay. Well, that leads right into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is how this struggle that you've had with anxiety has impacted, maybe your family life, your marriage, and other relationships, friendships, or people outside of your immediate family.
Yeah. So it's not obviously been easy over the years. And thankfully, I have a very patient husband. But, in any relationship, when, there's a problem, oftentimes guys just like to fix it. And I know that sounds very stereotypical. So maybe it's not just guys, but there are people within relationships that just like to try to fix things. And if that could happen, I would love it. But sometimes that's not what I want. And so, when I was a lot younger and in our relationship, I just expected that he should know what I want or know how I'm feeling. And so over the years of our relationship, I have learned, and so has he, that if we need something or we need something to happen differently, it's okay to just say it. And so that's been helpful for me to just be able to say, this is what I'm going through. This is what's happening. I know that you probably want to fix it, but I just need you to listen to me, or I just need you to help me process it. And for me to even have those words to say has been a huge victory, I guess you could say, in that relationship, because before I would just cry about it or be upset and then get even more upset when he didn't do the exact thing I wanted him to do. So, and sometimes he will even ask me, are you looking for ways to solve this, or do you just need to talk? And so that's been very helpful. But kind of the hard part for me is that sometimes my anxiety kind of manifests itself in different ways. And so for me, it's being in control. I mean, I think that's kind of the root thing about all of this anyway, is I don't have control over the situation, and I can't, manage how I want it to be managed, or I can't make certain things happen. And so I can get really nasty, nitpicky, overcritical, be outright defiant, or like just shut down. And I try really hard to not do that with my son, but I'm human and those things happen. Thankfully, I have a very resilient child, and I also have a good relationship in which I can say to him, I'm really sorry that I acted that way. And, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? That sort of thing. So it's a lot of really trying to humble myself when I come to those sort of moments where I'm not doing really well. And if I need to, I give myself a timeout.
Yeah.
And I'd rather just give myself a timeout and be able to kind of step away and not have those type of interactions. But sometimes I don't even realize that it's happening until after it's happened. So I don't know if that's a really concise answer, but
Yeah. Well, it sounds, I'm thinking two things here. One is your own self-awareness of what's going on with you
yeah.
and recognizing those moments that you're starting to struggle. And
Yeah.
then communication, like communicating openly with your husband, with your son, and then also that willingness to resolve after maybe something hasn't gone very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like you said, we're all human and we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to say
Yeah.
things we don't mean. But especially if you're in a moment of higher stress, a higher anxiety, it's easier to do that without even realizing that you're doing it. So yeah. A couple more things I want to ask you about. One is you mentioned earlier, being able to be aware of the things that might ramp up your anxiety. So how have you worked on identifying triggers and be prepared to handle those?
Yeah. So I think this is really the hard work of anxiety, is trying to figure out what your triggers are and then what is really underlying under those. And this work can be really difficult. It can be really hard to process and it can take a long time. But I have found for myself that these triggers are just sort of surface layer when it comes to dealing with this. And really, there's something deeper going on under it. So for me, flying is a trigger for me. I hate flying. I get really worked up. I have to take medication just about every time that I fly.
Mm-hmm.
If there's any wrench in the situation, it completely sends me, and I feel like I have zero control over the situation. But as we are talking about this, it is really not about flying, it's about the sense of control.
Right.
So a lot of times these triggers often go back to control issues. And so for me, that's what it turns out to be usually. So when I'm walking into a situation that I can control, that I don't know what's going to happen, that's really unknown, those are triggers for me. And so I have sort of learned to kind of have a self dialogue about these things, like, this is going to happen, you are not going to be able to control it, it's going to be okay, you have all of these sort of skills to handle it. And then it sounds really weird, but I have this conversation with myself where I'm kind of like not psyching myself up, but I'm like counseling myself through it, if you will. And so that has been really helpful for me. And even still to this day, if I figure out that there's some type of trigger that I didn't anticipate, it still throws me for a loop. So, these things are things that I can work on and that I can try to identify. But, sometimes these things will come up. And honestly, I thought that the whole coronavirus COVID thing would be a trigger for me, but thankfully it hasn't. And I've been trying to do my best to kind of work through that and not go to all of those scary places.
Yeah.
And, thankfully I just feel like the Lord is protecting my mind when it comes to that. And I truly feel like in certain situations, He has really done that, really protected me, because I would look back and think that is a trigger area for me and I didn't have to deal with it. And I know that He is protecting me. I can just sense it in my spirit. So
yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
that
sounds like a win that you've had recently.
Yes.
Which is good.
It is definitely a win.
Yeah.
Staying home all the time has been difficult, but as far as the actual what's going on, that is definitely a win.
Yeah.
So.
And if somebody's listening way far in the future, we are recording this in April of 2020, which is right in the midst of the global pandemic of the coronavirus, where everybody is basically quarantined at home.
Yeah.
And even for someone who doesn't deal with anxiety, it's getting a little difficult.
Yep.
So I was talking to somebody the other night who said they haven't left their house. Like they haven't driven anywhere for 28 days. And I was like, no, I can't do that. Sorry.
Oh
I
no,
have had to drive places.
we go for drives.
Once,
We don't get out of our car, but we go
Yeah.
for drives. I just need to look at nature or
Yes.
someone else's face through a window, see that there is life out there. I need that.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So you mentioned earlier, that when you did your counseling with Sandy, that was really a moment of victory, I guess you would call it, or
Yeah.
or healing. Are there any other moments or wins or moments of victory that you would want to share?
Yeah, so I think that there are little ones along the way. For me, it's been pretty much looking back on them and claiming them as victory, because it's really easy to brush over them and not assign them the title of victory and have really negative thoughts about it. So just the fact that I was able to go to a doctor and talk about this and ask for medication was a victory. The fact that, I don't necessarily feel bad about needing to take medication when I fly.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes just being a champion for your own health is a victory, and allowing yourself to do the things that will make you feel better and will help you be better. Those are victories. And so those are kind of victories that I see. I think the other thing is I'm not really afraid to talk about it anymore. When I was younger, it was a lot about, putting on the guise of having everything all together. And I don't feel that way anymore.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that in and of itself is a victory, because talking about it sometimes really pulls the rug out from the power that it has on you. And so being able to go to those trusted people when I'm really struggling is such a lifeline and feels so good and so supportive, rather than me sticking in isolation and feeling alone. And so I feel like sometimes it feels like I'm on this island with me and anxiety. And it just feels like I'm the only one here. I'm the only one dealing with this. I'm the only one fighting. And sometimes it feels like too much. But each time that there's something that helps me, it feels like I'm building a bridge. I'm building a bridge to all of these different areas. And the more bridges I have, the more that I'm able to find one when I need it. And the more that I use it, the easier it is to take. And I know that sounds a little bit silly, but it's honestly a muscle that you have to work and that you have to do even when you don't feel like it. To follow that analogy, like there are times when I feel like I couldn't even take one step onto a bridge or even walk across it. And so I've learned that I have to make myself do it. And I've had to make myself ask for help or make myself talk about it with trusted people. And sometimes that's all I need. Sometimes I need more. Sometimes I need, those heavier hitters, I guess, if you will. But, that's just how I've sort of dealt with it. So,
yeah. When you were just talking about that, it made me think of the movie Inside Out. Where she has the different islands, the family island.
That's right.
And I just had to look it up because I was like, the family island, the friendship island, and it's that idea of like, there's these different resources that you can pull on at different times that are available to you, and that you don't have to be alone in this journey.
Yeah, exactly.
So, exactly. Awesome. Okay. So last question for you is, let's just kind of wrap things up with talking about leadership and how this has impacted your leadership journey over the years.
Yeah. So, we talked about kind of exercising the muscle of sort of doing things when they're scary. And honestly, for me, like that has been one of the things that I've had to do the most. And leadership to me feels like doing scary things, doing like the next scary thing. If there's one thing that people with anxiety do well, it's doing things when they're scared.
Yeah.
Because they're scared all the time. So for me, walking into those next levels of leadership have just been an exercise in doing things that are scary. And I'm used to that. It is adrenaline pumping and heart throbbing and really scary, but I've had to do that at least once a week, every day for my life, if not more, sometimes every day. So, when I talk about this, it really is really interesting to kind of look over from, the 10,000 foot view, because as I look at my personality and kind of how I'm wired, I definitely know that leadership is in there and that I've always wanted to be a leader, and that that's just in me, whether it's a spiritual gift or whether it's a natural gift, I'm not sure. And I think I would have 10 years ago, 15 years ago, thought that anxiety would have disqualified me in a big, big way. And I would have never ventured off into pursuing leadership because I would have thought I'm too broken, or I'm not going to do this right because of this thing that I'm dealing with. And I'm so glad that I didn't really hold on to that, or that I worked through that, because if anything, because of anxiety, I get to the place where I have a dependence on God much more quickly, because I know that I'm keenly aware of the risks and all the disasters that could happen, because I've already gone there in my mind. So for me, I try to mentally prepare for things to the best of my ability. There's a fine line between overthinking and over obsessing, but for the most part, I've learned that when God calls me to do something, and it's scary, if I jump, he's always going to catch me. He's always there with me. Even if disaster happens, he's eternally faithful. And I have lived through that. I have walked through that, and I've done that multiple times. So I know that to be true. So that's kind of how I've been able to kind of level up, if you will, in leadership and kind of go towards those next steps. And I think the other piece of that is doing it with people that I love and trust. So there are people that, as we talked about before, that can kind of play into your anxiety and ramp it up. And then there's others that create calmness and trust. And so when I find those people, I stick with them. And you are one of those people. So if I can partner with someone that I can lean on in the leadership process, then I generally will have a higher degree of success. But I don't think I'm talking about anything that is unique to anxiety. I think that is just how leadership is. And whether you deal with a mental illness or not, I think these are things that you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to do things scared. You're going to have to find people that you love and trust who are part of, this team, part of this, moving forward in leadership. So while anxiety does play a big role, and while it is sometimes something that I have to fight through, I think that it's uniquely gifted me for leadership, because I'm already in the place where I need to have dependence on God. He has to do it for me anyway. He has to be the one that is leading the next steps. He has to be the one that's working things out. And, I'm walking into unknown places. And for someone with anxiety, that can be really scary. And doing things that I've never done before, speaking to people, or, doing a podcast, that can be really scary. But I have learned that if God is calling me to do it, that the reward of a deeper relationship with Him and the reward of affecting people positively with His love outweighs all of the really scary and hard stuff that I have to go through to get there. And honestly, sometimes I even forget, when I think back on the time that I spoke at our women's retreat, I pretty much had anxiety attacks all over that. But when I think back on that memory, I don't think about that. I think about the way that God used that, the way that He spoke into my life, and the ways that it's meant something for His kingdom. So while it may have been difficult at the time, He thankfully has crafted those memories to be about Him and not about the anxiety.
Yeah. I love that. I think this is just such an awesome place to end our conversation, because ultimately it's, like you said, it's really about being willing to be used by God and not allowing any struggle that any of us have, because maybe you're listening to this and you've never struggled with anxiety, but there might be something else. And it may not be, like you said, it may not be a mental illness, but it could be some other sin or some other challenge that you've faced or experience you've had in your past, or anything that you think disqualifies you from leadership. But that's not true. And ultimately what's true is that God can use us because he's going to be the one that supplies what we need to do what he calls us to do. So it's such a good ending. Is there anything else that you didn't share that you want to say before we?
I guess the only thing is, I would just ask people or encourage people to really not be afraid to start a process with themselves about what's going on, and to really do their best to try to find, even if it's just one person in your life that you can trust, to find that person. Because I know some people don't have that in spades the way I feel like I do. And so if you can do the work, if you can ask God to supply you with that person and someone that's really grounded in his word and in a relationship with him, I think that those things are crucial, because the Holy Spirit will remind me of his word, but I also need people around me to remind me of who God is and his word and the things that he has for me. And so if you can do your best to kind of set up your life like that, whether it's mental illness or anything else, I mean, it doesn't have to be mental illness, it could be any sort of thing that you're going through. Those will be huge, huge tools for you in the future. And that's really,
Yeah. And I think I'm just thinking that there's kind of three things that I would encourage people to try and do out of this conversation. Be honest with yourself, first of all. Like if this conversation that you just listened to brought something up in you and you're like, oh, and you just want to brush over it and run away, then maybe try and first sit down and be honest with yourself. Be honest with God, like talk to God about it, be honest with him. And then this last point that you just pulled out is be honest with someone else. Like find somebody that you can talk to and be open about what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And I think if you do those three things, you're moving in the right direction.
Totally agree.
Okay, so we are going to wrap up our episode, but, we were like, well, this is kind of a difficult topic. This is a challenging topic, but we still want to end our episode with a fun question, because laughter is good medicine for everybody. And
we need the release from all of the stress.
And somebody in our Purposeful Leadership Facebook groups told us the other day that they love when we tell our stories or, be silly and laugh. So we're going to do that here. Well, I don't know. We might laugh. We might not. Who knows?
I'm going to laugh because I need to laugh. So,
okay. All right. So the fun question. Are we ready? Do you want to ask it? Because I've been asking all the questions.
Yes, you have. Okay. So you answer first. So Esther, who was your first celebrity crush?
Okay. So
I hope it's someone really embarrassing.
I don't feel super embarrassed by it.
Oh, man. All right. Okay, go ahead.
All right. So I became aware of the band DC Talk.
Oh, yes.
I want to say 7th or 8th grade year, right? Like right when they were starting out. And I went to my first concert, I think in 8th grade. And I was head over heels in love with Kevin Max. Like, that was, I mean, I liked all three of them. I liked Toby Mac and, Michael Tate. I liked them all, but really Kevin Max had my heart. Yeah. So for many years, I was quite obsessed with him. In fact, when I met my husband now and he found out how much I liked DC Talk and then also that I liked Kevin Smith, he was like, yeah, I don't like him. I don't like it. He would specifically say that he didn't like him in the band. I was like, you just don't like him because I like him. So that was mine.
Oh, man.
Now I'm definitely over the crush now. Definitely over the crush. But in the teenage years, and before he was married and before I was married, that was definitely a thing.
But I think, will he always have a soft spot in your heart?
Yeah. I still like him. Like I still follow him and stuff, but it's definitely different. Yeah. But yes. What about you, Holly? Who was your celebrity crush?
Oh,
or your first celebrity crush?
Mine is not so Christian.
Oh.
Oh,
Okay,
gosh.
now I want to know.
So when I was in middle school, high school, my parents were pretty strict on what I could watch and what I
Yes.
couldn't watch.
Oh, I hear that.
Dirty Dancing was definitely on the no-no list.
Uh-huh.
But my friend down the street did whatever she wanted. And so she offered for me to come down and watch this movie at her house. And my parents would never have to know because her parents were not home.
Right.
So I went down and watched this movie. And let me tell you, I fell head over heels in love with Patrick Swayze.
Oh, boy.
Head over heels.
Oh.
And you'd think that as I grew up and was like out of my parents' house, I would have watched all these movies that had Patrick Swayze in it. But I really didn't. I just kept rewatching Dirty Dancing. There are a few other movies that he's in that I really like. But yeah, he was just so, himself.
Yeah, that was definitely on the no-no list for me too. Back in the day. I don't think I actually watched that movie until well into my, 30s.
Well, it's still one of my favorite movies.
Yeah.
And my parents were right to not allow me to watch that.
Mm-hmm.
But he was such a good dancer and he had really muscular self. And he was very confident. And I think I still might have a little bit of a crush on him. But of course, he has since passed away. That was very heartbreaking as well. But yeah.
Okay. Well,
let's have a moment of silence for Patrick.
Okay. I did have also a non-Christian.
Oh, you did?
Band crush, and that was Brad Pitt.
Oh, really?
I was the typical Brad Pitt fanatic of the teenage years.
Never really liked him.
No.
And even more so, I'm a huge Friends fan. So when the whole relationship broke up between him and Jennifer Aniston, I was like, yep, I knew it all along. You guys shouldn't like him. How could he do that to Rachel? But actually, now that you say it, I did have a Christian crush too.
Well, who was that?
It was Mac Powell from Third Day.
Oh, Mac Powell.
I mean, I was a big DC Talk fan.
Yeah.
And they were probably my most favorite, but I didn't really crush on any of them. It was Mac Powell.
Okay.
From Third Day.
His voice is still pretty powerful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I just posted a song from him the other day.
I know. One of my most favorite songs.
Yes.
I love that song. So good. Oh, okay. And when we talked about our Christian band likings or whatever, I was shocked that you were not as hardcore of a Third Day fan.
Well, because Third Day borders on the country sound a little bit.
I can see that.
I think that they weren't really in that category, but I really don't like country. But I did like earlier on, especially, I really liked Third Day. Like their first couple albums, I was definitely into that.
There were some songs that were pretty hard.
Yeah.
And I liked them.
Yep. All right. For all you who are listening who didn't grow up with these bands, you're like, who are these people?
Yeah.
All right. Well,
you can at least check them out. Listen to a few songs.
They're still classics.
So good.
Yep.
Listen to the Jesus Freak album.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember the name of the Third Day album, but it has fire on it. Consuming Fire.
Well, that was one of the songs was Consuming Fire, but I don't know what the name of it.
But I don't remember the name of the CD.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway.
We'll put it in the show notes, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Okay. Well, I have no idea how long this episode is. So if you're still listening, thank you.
Thank you.
And
feel free to cut out what you need to.
Next week, come back because we are going to have a conversation with Dr. Barbara Lowe. And it's a really
good.
awesome conversation. Yeah. So you are going to love that. So make sure you come back and we will talk to you then.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast. And it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.